A mother on a flight asks for nothing more than a glass of water for her children. But what happens next shocks everyone on board. A simple request turns into a confrontation that forces a flight attendant to be removed from service. And the truth behind why it all happened will leave you questioning everything. If it was supposed to be a routine flight, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A black family, a mother named Rachel Carter and her two young children, boarded a plane headed from Atlanta to New York. After hours of waiting at the airport and another hour spent in the air, they were all feeling drained, ready to get to their destination. The children, restless and thirsty, began asking their mom for a drink. Rachel, trying to stay calm and keep everything together, simply looked around and noticed the flight attendants walking down the aisle. She decided to ask for some water for her kids, a small request, one she assumed would be quickly granted. But when she spoke to the flight attendant, a young woman named Emily Daniels, she was met with an unexpected response. Emily didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her request, and instead just nodded briefly without a word. It was odd, but Rachel, trying to keep things simple, thought maybe Emily had missed the request in the chaos of the busy flight. She asked again, this time a bit louder. "Excuse me, can we please have some water for the kids?" Emily's eyes briefly met hers, but the response was colder than Rachel expected. Without saying a word, Emily just walked away, disappearing into the back of the plane. Confused and now growing more frustrated, Rachel looked at her kids. They were still thirsty, still waiting, and she knew that a simple glass of water shouldn't be such a challenge. As the minutes passed, the discomfort began to settle in. Passengers around her started to notice the exchange and the awkwardness in the air. She felt the eyes of others, but no one spoke up. Emily walked past several times, but had yet to bring the water Rachel had requested. Her kids were becoming more and more restless, the plane ride dragging on longer than it should have. Rachel decided it was time to try again. "Excuse me," she said, standing up from her seat. "Can I please get some water for my children?" This time, Emily paused, but only for a brief moment. Her eyes narrowed, and without any sign of empathy, she responded, "I'm busy right now." The words hit harder than Rachel expected, leaving her stunned. She had been polite and respectful, yet Emily seemed uninterested, almost dismissive. Rachel tried to stay calm, but this wasn't just about water anymore. She felt like she was being treated differently in a way she couldn't fully explain but certainly felt. At this point, Rachel's confusion started to turn into frustration. She couldn't understand why something so simple, a request for water, was being met with resistance. The kids, now growing even more uncomfortable, began to fidget in their seats. Emily's dismissive behavior had already made the situation tense, and it was clear that something wasn't right. Rachel sat back down, trying to reassure her children that everything was fine, but the discomfort was building in her chest. She glanced around the cabin, hoping to find a bit of understanding from the other passengers. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others seemed to sense the tension in the air. It felt as if no one was willing to speak up, no one willing to challenge Emily's behavior. The minutes ticked by, and the mother's mind raced. She thought about all the times in her life when she'd been treated unfairly, when her requests had been ignored, and the moments when she'd been dismissed simply because of who she was. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about her children. She couldn't let this pass. They were thirsty, they were tired, and they deserved better than this. Determined, Rachel stood up once again, this time walking directly to the front of the plane where the senior flight attendant, a woman named Laura Simmons, was stationed. Laura was the one in charge, the one who would have to do something about this. Rachel's steps were firm, each one a signal of her frustration and resolve. When she reached the front, she didn't hesitate. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice still calm but edged with something sharper. "The flight attendant in the back refused to give my children water. She's ignored our request twice now." Laura glanced at her, then at Emily, who was still working the aisle. There was a noticeable shift in Laura's demeanor, but she didn't say anything immediately. Instead, she turned to Emily, her face hardening slightly. "I'll take care of it," she muttered before walking away. Rachel waited, trying to keep her composure, but every second felt like an eternity. She had come this far and wasn't about to back down. As Laura approached the back of the plane, Rachel watched from the front. She saw Emily turn toward Laura. But this time there was no kindness in Emily's eyes. Instead, there was something else, irritation, maybe even anger. The tension in the cabin grew, not just between Rachel and Emily, but throughout the entire space. Passengers started to sit up straighter in their seats, clearly sensing that something was happening. But nobody said anything. The air was charged, heavy with unspoken words. Then, as Laura turned away, Rachel overheard something that made her blood run cold. It was a whisper, just low enough not to be immediately heard, but clear enough to make her freeze. Emily muttered, "Not all requests are treated the same." The words hit her like a slap. Not all requests are treated the same. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Did she really just hear that? The air in the cabin suddenly felt stale, thick with something that didn't sit right. She had been trying to keep her emotions in check, to stay calm for her kids. But that phrase, it was more than just a rude comment. It was a clear message, one that hit her in a way she couldn't ignore. Her heart started to pound. Was this about race? Was that why her simple request for water was being treated like an inconvenience? Was it because of who she was, because of the color of her skin, that she was being dismissed so coldly? The more she thought about it, the more her anger grew. But so did her sense of disbelief. How could this happen in 2025? How could someone be treated this way for something as basic as asking for water? Rachel turned back to her seat, trying to collect herself. But the weight of the situation was sinking in deeper by the second. Her children, still sitting quietly in their seats, hadn't fully understood what had been happening. They were just thirsty. But now Rachel knew without a doubt that something wasn't right. This wasn't just about water. It was about something deeper, something that was making her feel like she and her children didn't belong. Passengers around her had started to murmur quietly among themselves. Rachel glanced at them, looking for any sign of support, but they all quickly looked away, as if hoping to avoid getting involved. One woman, who had seemed sympathetic earlier, caught Rachel's eye for a moment and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. But that was all. No one was stepping in. No one was speaking out. And that made Rachel feel more alone than ever. The minutes dragged on, and Rachel's frustration grew. She wasn't just asking for water anymore. She was demanding respect. She looked at her kids, who were now fidgeting in their seats, and she knew she had to stand her ground. This wasn't just about her. It was about showing her children that they deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter what. Rachel stood up once again, this time more firmly than before. Something inside her had shifted. She wasn't going to let this moment pass. As she made her way back to the front of the plane, she noticed the tension in the air growing thicker. Passengers were watching now, their eyes following her every move. She could feel their judgment, their discomfort, but she didn't care. She was done being silent. When she reached Laura again, Rachel spoke with a newfound determination. "This isn't just about water anymore," she said. "This is about the way my family has been treated." I overheard what she said. Not all requests are treated the same. What did she mean by that? Laura blinked, her face hardening for a brief moment before regaining her composure. She gave a slight nod, but offered no real apology. "I'll speak with her," she said, her voice low but matter of fact. "That's not enough," Rachel replied, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't just poor service. This is disrespect." Laura hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But then she turned back to Rachel, saying only, "Please take a seat. I'll handle it." Rachel didn't move. She wasn't about to be dismissed again. She had already tried to handle this quietly. But now the issue was too big to ignore. As she returned to her seat, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She looked at her children, who were now drawing on the backs of the seats in front of them, happily lost in their own little world. They hadn't seen the tension, hadn't felt the sting of being treated like they didn't belong. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Minutes passed before Laura returned to Rachel's row. Her face was slightly flushed, and there was a subtle tension in her posture. She stopped beside Rachel's seat, her eyes flicking nervously from Rachel to the kids. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, it seemed like she wasn't sure what to say. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "I just wanted to apologize for the earlier situation. It was unacceptable, and we are taking the matter seriously. I've spoken to the crew, and we're looking into it further. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior from any of our staff." Rachel nodded, not fully convinced. "Thank you," she said, but her tone was flat. The apology felt hollow. Looking into it further didn't change the fact that her children had been denied something as basic as water. It didn't change the fact that her request had been treated with disdain and prejudice. "Is she going to be removed from the flight entirely?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't going to let the matter rest just because Emily had apologized. Laura hesitated for a moment. "She has been removed from active service for the remainder of the flight. She will not be serving passengers again." Rachel thought about that for a second. It wasn't a punishment she felt was enough. Emily had already done damage, and no matter how many apologies were given or how many investigations followed, it wouldn't change the way Rachel had been treated. It wouldn't change the experience for her children. The rest of the flight passed in a tense, uncomfortable silence. When the plane finally landed in New York, Rachel stayed back as other passengers disembarked. She wasn't done yet. As she approached the gate attendant, Rachel's voice was calm but firm. "I want to make sure that this is taken seriously," she said. "What happened on that plane wasn't just bad service. It was discrimination. I need to know that the airline will address this properly." The gate attendant nodded, offering Rachel the contact information for the airline's customer service department. But Rachel could see the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of discomfort that came with addressing a situation like this. As she walked away, Rachel knew this wasn't over. She wasn't going to let it be swept under the rug. She wasn't just fighting for herself or her children. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated as if they didn't matter. The fight for dignity, respect, and equality wasn't always easy, but it was necessary, and Rachel was ready for it.